Lawyers of Reddit. At what point when working for a defendant did you realize my client is a monster? Story 1. I listened to a 911 call where the victim's throat was slit while on the call by our client. I will never forget her gurgling and sounding like she was dying. Somehow she ultimately lived through this, saying, "He killed me, he killed me." Story 2. I'm on the other side, but I've got a defendant who went to prison for starving 3 adopted children to the point that they needed weeks of hospitalization, then got out of prison and married a guy with children so that she could start starving them too. Listening to her interview where she attempts to justify what she did to both sets of kids disturbed me more than any of the murder cases I've worked on. Story 3. When I had to go to the U.S. Attorney's office to view the evidence in his case, there they were, the hundreds of images of child he had traded, the close-up images of his baby's genitals that he had taken and sent around the internet, the pictures of his neighbor's daughters playing in their kiddie pool. Realized he just could not help himself. But he also never once claimed responsibility or showed remorse, so I don't feel too badly for him. Story 4. I had a client who was accused of domestic violence. Essentially, he threw his girlfriend out of a second-story window. Now, he's got a terrible history. But so do a lot of my clients, and his attitude is a little entitled. Also typical. But he also knows the deal and wants a plea deal. So I'm not really prepared when he absolutely refuses the no-jail offer from the state. Keep in mind there were like 5 witnesses. Why? Because they wanted him to pay for her medical bills. Okay, but whatever. Not the worst. What did it was his counteroffer. "I ain't paying that bitch's bills. Tell him I'll pay for the window." Prosecutor was not happy. Story 5, criminal defense lawyer. I can name a few instances where I was just absolutely disgusted with my client. Caveat, these are mostly years ago when I was taking just any old case. I most practice white collar and federal now. 1. I won a DUI case because the government messed up on something right before trial was to begin. My client gives me a hug and completely reeks of alcohol. He is driven to court. I took his keys and called his mother. 2. Client who was accused of molesting a 12-year-old. He was mid-40s at the time, and I had to shut him down real quick when he tried to tell me how the 12-year-old was coming on to him. 3. I represented a woman for a grand theft charge. Left her in my office to get some things copied before she left. After she left, I realized my sunglasses and car keys were stolen. I tracked her down in the lobby and told her I was not going to represent her anymore, and I would call the police if she didn't empty her pockets in front of me and give me my things for. I had a client who was released after 25 years in prison for murder, and then the same day he beats up his prospective new landlord. He ended up getting another 10 years. He was unrepentant and laughed about how he hit the guy so hard his eyeball popped out. I thought, this guy deserves to be in prison. Took the case to trial anyway, and shocker, lost and he got 10, the max. 5. Client who pretended to be a doctor so he could sell steroids. According to the Gov, he had numerous clients who were made to believe that his steroids would cure their cancer. They paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and some of them died. I just thought that was pure evil. Story 6. I've done a lot of prison legal aid, and I could tell stories about child molesters that would turn you green. But instead, I'll turn you green a different way. I had a kid, 17, who was mildly cognitively disabled due to brain trauma he sustained at the hands of his birth parents, who ended up with a really wonderful foster care family and thrived. He was a popular kid in school, good athlete, got a girlfriend and invited her to meet up and be teenagers one night in a corn silo, which I guess is a thing that country kids do. I don't know. This all comes from the pre-sentence investigation report I read before taking his case, but this girl met him at the silo, and they were hanging out inside. By his account, they were having a nice time, and he was really enjoying himself. Then, for no particular reason, he picked up a 2x4 and bashed her skull in. He then used a combination of very crude farm implements, shovels, hoes, to chop her body up and bury it in the corn, and went home like nothing had happened. Hey, you asked? ETA, holy, I didn't expect to wake up to 11K in karma and 100 replies this morning. I'll try to reply to those I can. And I do appreciate the gesture of giving me Reddit currency, but folks, Reddit has enough money, and when the firm needs more, they can go back to their venture capitalists. I would encourage you to make a donation to your local or another reputable charity instead. Story 7. Oh, I can share a good story. I had a teacher in high school who was a former lawyer. We always asked him why he gave up his practice to start teaching. He finally caved and explained that his last case was the defense of 3 people. Apparently, there had been a 4th. It was 2 couples, who in the act of a drunken, drugged out, decided to kill, partially eat, and dismember one of the women. I guess it seemed like a good idea at the time. As a lawyer, he said it was pretty open and shut, but he had to get his clients the best result possible, and he was exposed to all the horrid details, the pictures, and their reasoning. My teacher had such a far-off look when he explained it that we could see it really got to him. Story 8. The first week I started at my current criminal defense firm, I was tasked with cataloging discovery from our client's phone. The phone had multiple, talking around 4,000 videos, photos, text exchanges with women under 16, Though not all of the girls' ages were confirmed, most, if not all, were under the legal age of consent and many were barely pubescent, naked and being prostituted over 1 year. He would lure these girls in exchange for drugs. Nothing felt totally bizarre until I came across one video where he was clearly forcing himself upon a literal child who was so high on benzodiazepines, not willingly but rather forced, and choking her in the process. When our firm confronted him, he said he was in love with her and that's why he did it. He would also take these girls to hotels and make them have with one another while he taped, but nothing beat what I said above. Pretty horrifying stuff for my first week on the job. Story 9. Lifelong criminal defense lawyer here. To be completely honest, it's not about the offense, but about the person. I've had people accused of murder that I really kind of liked and thought well of. I've had people accused of shoplifting who have given me the heebie-jeebies and seemed like psychopaths. Speaking from purely a criminal standpoint, having a client who is a monster doesn't matter in terms of your duty to them, but it does make the job less pleasant. My worst clients have been people who are comfortable scamming others of their money. Story 10. My general psychology professor worked for the state of Arkansas assessing criminals to see if they would qualify as criminally insane. He told us a story one time about a guy who would get glass shards and hide them underneath his skin, presumably to use at a more opportune time. He said his interview with the guy made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Story 11/EU/Tinyajima stole my twist. Murder, robbery, and most crimes involve regular people who did or may have done something stupid due to alcohol or situations. But the client you keep an eye out are the ones charged with fraud and the like. Liars, cheats, and all-around shady people generally speaking. Even the gangs operate on a code of conduct. An old-fashioned warlike code of conduct. Honor and courage are important to them even though they commit crimes. 22 years threatened twice, so not that bad. The real danger? Not in criminal law. It's family law. That's where people get really heated. It's personal. Story 12. Had a divorce client, husband and father, who disowned his autistic son, tried to argue that he should get all of his wife's retirement having not worked for 12 years, contacted me during the height of Hurricane Sandy, he was in the Bronx and me in Manhattan, saying he wanted to hold his wife in contempt for not paying him that day while the storm slammed NYC, told me I was making a huge mistake getting married. My wedding date was November 3rd, 4 days after Sandy, saying that I was going to be miserable and regret it. I could go on. But the worst was when, several months later, since his divorce was taking a long time, he sent death threat letters to myself and my wife saying that he had hired an executor to kill the two of us if his divorce wasn't finalized in 60 days. Called the police and they said he left his premises 1 day earlier. I heard nothing from him until February 2014, when he emailed me saying he needed a winter coat from his wife, and could I help get it for him. Ironically, the divorce didn't have to be completed because he killed himself before the judge signed the judgment of divorce. TLDR. Miserable guy who wanted to spread his misery and crossed the line when he threatened to kill my wife. Edit. For something a little lighter, this Memorial Day weekend reminds me of not my worst client, but definitely my dumbest. I was representing her on a child custody and child support matter. She was calling me on Memorial Day saying she really needed to speak to me. I called her back and asked if it was urgent since it was Memorial Day and all. She said, "Oh, I didn't think that Jews celebrated Memorial Day, so I thought you were going to be available." Edit 2. Because so many people have pointed it out, I have now put the word executor in quotes because that was his word and not mine. Also, since people have questioned it, my username is also the name of my firm. Story 13. My mom is one and she told me a story. She was defending a man that was accused of killing his whole family with an axe and burned their bodies. Yeah, he had 3 children, ages 3, 4, and 7, and a wife. My mom said she was afraid to talk to him because he just did not seem normal at all. She said that he was very freaky and that he would just stare at her for no reason for a long time. It still haunts her to this day. He got the death penalty and she was very happy. She didn't even care about the money. Edit 1. My most upvoted comment is about a man that killed his family. Thanks for the upvotes. Story 14. I'm a lawyer for people on death row. Although some of my clients have been convicted of horrible, sometimes nightmare-inducing crimes, I honestly have never had the thought, oh, this person is a monster. What I am far more likely to think is, 1. How do I convince my child to never try meth because meth psychosis is fucking real and horrifying? Or 2, I am so lucky to have been born into a family where my parents weren't violent, drug addicted, mentally ill, all of the above. Or 3, Jesus Christ. How differently things may have turned out if my client had had access to mental health services on the outside. Or 4, wow, this person who was completely dysfunctional on the outside has adapted really, really well to the structure that an institutional environment provides. Perhaps it's due to my own religious beliefs and to my analytical nature, but the idea that some people are just bad or monsters has never rung true to me, nor has it been borne out by my observed experience. Story 15. My mom is a lawyer. This is the story about how she quit being a public defender. When you are a public defender, you don't get to choose your cases. She got assigned a young man who, with the help of his gift friend, had gotten a kitten from a free to a good home ad in the paper. They then brought it home and gave it to their dog as a chew toy. I think they also filmed it. So yeah. She said she needed a shower after every meeting with him, canceled her PD contract after the case concluded. Story 16. Edit. For those asking what's wrong with allowing the child to choose, the answer is nothing, so long as the child has the maturity and mental capacity to do so, and wants to choose. This child had none of those things, and was forced to choose right then and there between two people the child loved very much. Also, I'm not making any commentary on which spouse was better. They both did this, ergo, they're both terrible. Not a lawyer, but was a paralegal for many years. I worked mainly in family law. As I am sure other posters are doing in order to preserve confidentiality, I'm going to be vague and also not include genders or locations. I had a client who was getting divorced. The client and soon-to-be ex-spouse had a 12-year-old son with autism. The two of them sat this poor fucking child down at the table one day and made him choose which parent he wanted to live with. Our client called me to gloat that the child had chosen in their favor and to direct that paperwork be prepared. This client was a prominent member of the business community and earned quite a high salary and was treating this child like a commodity. I was disgusted. I no longer work in law, but this one will always stick with me. Story 17. My SO's mother, Elle, was abusive. She frequently hit her husband, was a compulsive liar, and just generally made her family miserable. When they were settling the divorce, the judge initially deemed a testimony from the kids, my SO and her brother, unnecessary, probably because they were minors at the time, and testifying against one of their parents would be hard on them, to say the least. However, the lawyer representing Elle was really insistent that they testify. Well, it must have been a shock to the lawyer to suddenly have two more witnesses with dozens of accounts of driving under the influence. Domestic violence, ECT. We figured Elle must have lied to her lawyer about some significant details because they were completely caught off guard and more than a little angry after the testimony. We like to believe it helped solidify some of the criminal charges placed against her. It was a nice bit of karma after years and years of gaslighting and false rumors that her own lies got her caught. Story 18. Not the client, but my managing partner. The client was a senile 90-year-old man. He wanted to sell land worth a little less than $1 billion to some businessmen. Suffice to say, there were many who wanted to take advantage of the situation. One such person, to my dismay, was our managing partner. The partner wanted to insert a provision that would have effectively funneled about 60% of the proceeds solely to him. You could see how his eyes gleamed at the mere mention of money. The provision got lost in the revisions. I was doing the revisions. I'm no longer part of that scummy firm. Story 19. A lot of years ago, I used to work as a solicitor's representative. Cases go to Crown Court, barrister deals, and I am there for paperwork, additional stuff with client, etc. 70-something-year-old man had been in jail for 15 years for an assault on a child. Solicitor and barrister working on getting him released due to him getting clean reports from just about everyone. Guards took him out of jail to a dentist, and as he entered the waiting room, he saw two children and ran straight at them. Guards stopped him. 3 weeks later at court, I was the one that sat him down in a room to explain that no, this isn't a hearing to release you. It is so you can be committed to a mental health secure facility for the rest of your life. He didn't take that well. I shed no tears. Story 20. I got arrested when I was younger and wound up county jail for a bit. When you first get transferred there from the police station holding, you end up seeing a judge who sets your bail. The whole thing is done from inside the jail and through a TV screen, so you never see the judge or your public defendant in person. It was my first time doing this whole thing, and I was sticking nearby this guy that went by Repo, who had been in and out of jail before. We're waiting for our turn in front of the judge, and there is this kid ahead of us. They really didn't care much about privacy, so you could hear the whole thing if you were next in line. This was barely 18 years old, like just a week over, and he had a rap sheet that was extremely long. They get to the current charge that he was in there for, which was allegedly smacking a brick over the head of an elderly man and robbing him. I was very surprised by that, but I was even more surprised at how Repo reacted to this. Even though he had been in and out of the system for all sorts of crimes and had met a ton of other criminals, something like that was over the top for him, especially since this kid was so young. It's pretty sad to think that this kid's life was already that messed up at such a young age, and was probably going to get worse from there. Story 21. Not a lawyer, but my dad is. He has told me the story of why he stopped being a criminal defense lawyer. He got a case with a couple young Russian guys who were charged with securities fraud. My dad worked super hard on the case and got the guys a great deal with some probation, a fine, and some community service. That night, the guys treated my dad to dinner, and on the TV in the bar was a news story about insurance fraud, and one of the guys said, "Hey guys, security fraud is old news, let's try that next," and pointed at the TV. That night, my dad came home to my mom and said, "I can't do criminal defense anymore, because he realized the people he was defending were truly bad people. Story 22. Oh man, I'm always late when I have a good one. Not a defendant, but a divorce. Client is a late 30s woman, 2 kids, idyllic suburban life with her incredibly lucrative medical profession husband. He caught her cheating. He wanted to patch things up. She decided on a divorce. So far, nothing out of the ordinary, unfortunately. Then I start getting the details. He caught her on his birthday, in their bed, while the kids were downstairs. Dude decided to come home early as a surprise, and his wife was getting dicked down by a 19-year-old. But wait, there's more. Really fun stuff from the husband. Guy had been treated for gonorrhea twice, and both times he had caught it from his wife. The second kid wasn't his. It was obvious because the child was 100% some race, and the dad was not that race. Bad stuff, right? Well, enter the texts, emails, etc. She was carrying on like a dozen affairs at any given time, spanning years. She would bring them home and tell the kids they were electricians, plumbers, etc. She'd other guys within minutes of dropping her kids off at school. I've met some awful people in my time, but this woman straight up told me how much this guy loved her and how she manipulated the out of him. He knew about a lot of the stuff, and each time he found something new, he just tried to win her back. I don't want to go into the details of what happened, but some money that you get, you don't really want. Story 23. I'm a civil litigator. I've never thought my client is a monster asterisk, but there are a few I've thought were idiots or liars or both. 2 of my favorites are a client who instructed me, against my advice, to object to the temporary judge even though we had just discussed it and I had just told the fucking judge we were okay with him . And a client who testified pretty much the exact opposite of what she had told me in our initial meetings and what we had repeatedly discussed. Story 24. Civil defense here, so maybe not as juicy as the crim defense folks. Some of the work I do is employment defense, particularly sexual age harassment and discrimination cases. I'm pretty cynical and see a lot of cases where plaintiffs are full of, particularly in harassment discrimination cases. In one case, I was defending a company and that company's manager jointly. The manager seemed like a straight-up guy, and I pride myself in being a good judge of character. I was pretty convinced the case was just payback from a disgruntled employee. To my credit, the plaintiff, a 38-year-old female, was a really poor employee by all accounts. Still, it didn't prepare me from what I found doing a review of every email the company had stored on their servers. Not only did this guy stick his hand down this woman's shirt without consent, when she threatened to go to HR, he said he'd get her fired and make sure she never got a job again. The lady was a single mother with 3 kids. He also propositioned her in exchange for a day off. He thought the email had been wiped because the company had a 1-year retention policy. Apparently, some of the company's older emails remained on a server before the policy was put in place because of the migration of the emails from an older outsourced IT company. Not sure if my terminology is right here. I had to substitute out of the case thereafter for conflict reasons, since my 2 clients' interests were no longer aligned. Story 25. When he told me that both of his biological teenage daughters were lying about him raping them because he refused to let them go to prom, so they were mad at him. At Story 26. When this person, an executive, said she was firing any employee who had a serious illness or injury, while promoting fundraisers at a local church for cancer sufferers, no less, in part because employees, thinking she'd be sympathetic, would reveal their confidential health info to her. Story 27. The first and last family law case was assigned to me as a first-year associate. My client broke his wife's jaw and said if they were home in Russia, he would have killed her because he could pay his way out of prison there. Story 28. Defended my client in a lawsuit who defrauded his business partners. Evidence was already overwhelming that my client was liable. Client made matters worse by fabricating evidence and presenting it in court. He got called out on it by his dad's attorney who had the same evidence . It tanked my client's case. My client continued lying to me despite the overwhelming evidence showing he fabricated evidence. He lost big. In addition to a large judgment, he got hit with several felonies for fabricating evidence. Also, the business partners my client screwed over were his dad and brother. Story 29. Don't read this unless you have a strong stomach. Attorney's wife here. I used to help him file away evidence and reports. Came across a file with video. Curiosity got the better of me, especially when husband told me not to watch it. File gives this story. Woman was at boyfriend's trailer out in the middle of nowhere, got pissed off at boyfriend, so smacked him in the head with a metal bat and went on her merry way home. Boyfriend is apparently not a pleasant person, and nobody really misses him or looks for him. He is fired from work in absentia. On day 7, boyfriend's neighbor finally stops by, hears hoarse screaming, and calls police. That's where the video came from. Day 7. One of the cops was wearing a camera on his uniform. It shows him and his partner going through the house, finding dog shit all over the floor. Boyfriend's 2 Rottweilers, who were also in the house, went without food for about 6 days before they started eating bits and pieces of him. The camera shows the moment the cop found the body on its side, rolled it over, and he's blinking. eyes open, with most of his face gone. The woman didn't even bother to let our dogs out before she left. I do not help file cases anymore. Story 30. I could have got my client off on a technicality. He was already serving 10 years for armed robbery when another case came up of gang rape. I went to check the case file and saw that they had made a muck of gathering evidence and blood samples. The detective said he was just going to archives and pointedly left the file out. I read the woman's account of her 14 known assailants from her home village, including my client. I dropped the case then and there. He died in a gang initiation in prison shortly afterwards, but he was apparently one of the kingpins. Sometimes you have to know when to fold 'em. Story 31. I have a family member who used to work in the court system, lawyer. Once he told me that a kid pushed their grandma down the stairs and left her there to die, laughing and taunting her when she screamed in pain. To clarify, when I say young, I mean under 13 years of age. Yeah, I guess demon children really do exist. Also not sure how this case ended since I don't think they were tried as an adult. But hey, that's the courts for you. Story 32. Prosecutor here. Most of us in this profession have the utmost respect for those on the other side of the aisle. Most people really don't know or understand the really fucked up that we have to witness and deal with on a daily basis. There's a reason attorneys have the highest percentage of alcoholics by profession. Story 33. Had a client charged with his pet goat. Pictures of his undies full of goat hair and his bed littered with goat poo was something the like I have never seen in my career. When after the charges were dismissed, he asked me for help getting the goat back. SMH. Story 34. Late to the party, but anyways, my first internship in law school was at a matrimonial law firm in a very wealthy area. Think millionaires and billionaires getting divorced. One of the first cases I worked on involved the parents of a victim of a high-profile school shooting. The parents were divorced and had been prior to the death of the child, and were now battling over who would get the victim's compensation fund money and the funds they received from a fundraiser they set up themselves on a GoFundMe-type site. These were incredibly wealthy people fighting over what was literal chump change to them and asking the public to donate to them as if they needed it. They were so clearly exploiting the death of their child for money and to off the other parent. It was honestly one of the most disturbing things I have encountered, ever. Story 35. Not a lawyer, but work for a law firm as an investigator. One of our clients stabbed an ex-lover multiple times over $100. Perp then ran out of the house all. Neighbor and her teenage daughter see him covered in blood and rush inside to see if they can help while they call 911s. Victim is still alive. On the 911s call the daughter made, you can hear the mom singing Amazing Grace while she tried to stop the bleeding. You can also hear the victim, with a stab wound in her neck, gurgling on blood while she tries to sing along. The EMTs arrived in under 3 minutes, but it took the police 19 minutes from the call to show up to clear the scene for them. She lived for 17 minutes. I saw the photos of the scene with the body still in place. It looked like a scene straight from Dexter. Story 36. This was after I left practice in the UK and temporarily went back to my home country to work for a bit. Client was a mobster. Threw 2 grenades under the car of a rival mobster. Police storm his place with no evidence/warrant/reasonable suspicion. Dumbass cops didn't think to go through formalities before making arrest. Client calls me. I show up at station. Client's walking out a free man to have a smoke with me in about 15-20 mins. Says he heard through the grapevine that the rival mobsters, who wasn't in the car when it blew up, adult son decided to be a smart and give the cops an anonymous tip as opposed to letting his father deal with it. 3 days later, I see in the headlines, *rival mobster's house explodes in mysterious circumstances. Forensics say evidence at scene inconclusive. Forward it to my client, and he just replies, Story 37. My girlfriend was on the jury for a capital murder charge. He brutally raped and murdered a young mother and attempted to do the same to her toddler, who somehow miraculously, or not depending on how you look at it, survived. The son grew up and was about 14 by the time that this case was brought forward to determine if the death penalty would be used. Obviously, the killer had already been in prison, was found guilty long ago, or if he would avoid the death penalty and spend 3 life sentences in prison. He had originally attacked several women before this incident and sent 2 to the hospital, but was released with a slap on the wrist after serving minimal jail time. The murder was preventable, but leniency let this violent man back out on the streets. What is sad is that every single witness for the defense was a member of his family, and every single one of them was caught lying under oath, even over the most inconsequential things. It's as if the whole family, mother, father, brothers, and sisters, was physically incapable of saying anything truthful. None of them even showed any sympathy for the victims or even acknowledged that rape and murder are wrong. The killer showed no remorse either. What was really chilling, however, was the fact that every woman that he attacked looked strikingly similar to my girlfriend, and he stared at her with a blank expression almost the entire time. It really freaked her out, and she still has nightmares about it. Story 38. At first, he seemed like a normal white-collar guy. Suit, tie, dressed to the nines. He walked into my office with a briefcase in one hand and a cigar in the other. He was out of breath and looked exhausted. We had a long day ahead of preparing for his trial in the coming weeks. He suddenly asked me if I had about $3. 50, and it was then that I realized he was a giant crustacean from the Paleolithic era. Loch Ness Monster almost got me again. Story 39 Ianal, but a legal assistant. We got a client off of a murder charge. 2 weeks later, she was caught with a similar weapon and situation, except this time the guy didn't die. Story 40. Not an attorney, but worked as a paralegal for local county prosecutor's office and worked in the team that handled all child sexual assault cases. Actually, any sexual assault cases. Some of cases involving children were horrific, and I personally wanted to torture the pedophiles. They felt they were the victims as little kids seduced them, and so on. One day, I saw a bunch of little kids getting off a school bus, and the first thought I had was how many of them are being either molested or sexually assaulted. It was time to move out of there, and I then went to the team that handled homicide and drug cases. I happily looked through hundreds of autopsy photos then. I am forever tainted by all those reports I read and heard of stories told at seminars. Those pedophiles are evil, no other words for them. Story 41. Like always, not exactly the answer to this specific question, but I doubt you're going to have legitimate lawyers perusing Reddit and telling you about their cases. Seems like a very fine line of confidentiality to walk to tell internet strangers about things that happened in the courtroom, so I'll give my story. My ex-aunt has been through about 10 lawyer teams in what's going on an 8-year lasting custody battle. And we're not exactly in a place where there's that many lawyers. Her last and final group, she literally had to hire from another state because word has gone out in the legal community to not ruin your career associating with this woman. She has filed every CPS, CYS type of injunction accusing our entire family of rape and molestation to draw this out as long as possible. On my side, the one case that got brought up in court was that I had raped my then what would have been 8-year-old cousin while I was studying abroad, literally on the exact opposite side of the planet. Obviously, CYS can't just ignore a claim like that, but when it finally got to a judge after these accusations, and he realized, wait, this kid wasn't within thousands of miles of the child in about a year from when this supposedly happened, he brought her and her then lawyer up with contempt charges. I'm just vaguely describing it all. It gets way deeper and more fucked up. Thankfully, once a kid is 14, they get way more rights as far as court proceedings go, so he can finally tell the judge he wants nothing to do with his mom unless it's by his terms. Story 42. When I saw the state's discovery file, the video of the SWAT teams entering the residence, blood on the wall, wife's arm cut so deeply you could see all the insides, photos of the blade in the street, then reading their infant had been in her arms when it happened. Yikes. Story 43. Former juvenile court attorney and was listening to this case. I was not involved, so no RPC issue. 2 minors, both male, had decided to rob a pizza delivery guy, so they called for a delivery pizza to an empty apartment building. The delivery guy arrived and was subsequently robbed, something like a large pie, his phone, and a 2-liter. The minors then decide they want to take the delivery guy's car, so they take his keys. While one is trying to start the car, the other decides to sexually assault the delivery guy. Turns out the delivery guy's car was a manual stick shift, and the minors have no idea how to drive it. Instead of ending their crime spree, they then kidnap the driver and force him to drive them to their other friend's house across town. Once there, the same minor from earlier sexually assault the pizza delivery driver again. Then they beat up the delivery driver and run off. Driver makes it into a local shop down the road where he calls police. Adult offenders don't really bother me, but minors, their brains are not fully developed enough to understand the weight of their actions. Kids can be monsters. Story 44. I'm a retired correction officer from NYC, Rikers Island. I once had an inmate ask me to look at his case. I had once gotten a 100% innocent guy out of jail when I had just started, and I was considered one of the smarter COs. This guy shot another man to death at an ATM in Midtown Manhattan during a robbery attempt. It was all caught on videotape. The FBI had computer-enhanced one frame from the video in which the suspect's head was in full profile. His right ear was clearly seen and had a very distinctive characteristic. It was sort of square at the top and not rounded at all. His crooked, broken nose was all I needed to say to myself, he's guilty. What fucked my mind up was this POS was telling me he had every right to shoot the victim. He looked at himself as a professional robber. If you resisted, then he felt justified to you up. In this case, he shot and killed the ATM customer because he tried to fight back. I couldn't believe how this guy was behaving, smiling when he told me he was a professional. I went and got a book called Inside the Criminal Mind. It helped answer some questions I had about my new line of work. I have since retired from the NYD doc, and I'm so happy to put all that negative behind me.